So welcome back to part three. I hope this is the last part. We're getting close to where we are going to finish. So in 1914, the First World War started and things went back. Like a lot of tourism was before this, a lot of trade. But since this happened, trade declined. Then after the war, we have huge financial crisis. We also had like some nationalistic movements between countries where they didn't want to trade or doing tourism. And instead, they wanted to prepare for a second war where it was more important to have military than, I don't know, like maybe tourism or something like that. So the countries weren't prepared to a change, and economists were sad because they already realized about this. Like journals about economy, books about economy realized about this. Even Karl Marx thought about this. They say like it's not that important, that labor is the important thing, and we need to make our labor more prepared. Like at some point, those ideas from Marx were really interesting because he said like we need to prepare people to become more productive. Labor is the most important thing. If you think about David Ricardo, on the other hand, a more capitalistic approach is like we need to prepare a system that will allow people to gain capital because capital is the most important thing. But both of them thought about labor and capital, not about war. But politicians didn't think like that. That's why they had this war, and that's why they had the Second War. Because instead of thinking about improving labor or improving capital, they thought about improving war. That was a bad idea. Such a bad idea that a lot of people died, and it took them about 30 years to realize that it wasn't a good idea. But in 1944, when the Second World War was about to finish, then politicians agreed with economists and they said, we need to do something. We need to set the rules for whatever happens after this. So then they created two important institutions that I will explain in a second. And somehow, well, this can be mm, criticized somehow because the US and their allies kind of pushed their agenda, but they won the war, so they could do whatever they want. So, and somehow they were pushing ideas of making a more market open idea of this, and it kind of shaped the world that we have right now. So let me explain you. 1944, the world is about to end. Everyone knew that Germany and Japan will lose soon, and they had to prepare a plan after this. So they met in near Boston in the US, and they created first the United Nations, which was super important in terms of politics, but in terms of economy, they created two institutions that were very important, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So the objective of these two functions is first, the International Monetary Fund is for countries who don't have any money, that are broke, like at that time, Germany and Japan. And they say when they are broke, only not only Germany and Japan, but any other country who doesn't have any money or who needs to get a loan and no one is willing to give them any money, the International Monetary Fund will give them money because we can't abandon a country. They did that with Germany in 1918 and it was really bad. So the International Monetary Fund will lend money to countries who can't get access to credit. But, and this but is important, these countries will have to obey our policies. That's what the Americans and British and French said. If you are going to get money from here, you need to do with your economic policies what we want you to do. This is because you did something wrong. That's why people don't want to give you money. So we will teach you how to manage your economy. And some people criticize this because they say that's kind of bad, that's kind of manipulating. But other people say it's a good idea. We liked it. The World Bank is very similar. The World Bank is similar in the sense that they will lend money for things, but the objective of the World Bank is to end poverty. So any project that thinks about ending poverty will receive money from the World Bank. But again, it's tied to obeying some rules on economic policies. And in the end, after 70 years of this, we have good stories like Germany and Japan. They acquire money from the International Monetary Fund and from the World Bank. They obey the policies from the US and the UK and France, and they work out really well. They became super powerful countries. But we also have stories of countries who went for money from the IMF and then they did bad. An example is Mexico. Like we got money from the IMF, didn't work out. I think the rules that they set on us weren't that good because maybe cultural things, corruption, things like that are very Mexican, and they didn't consider, and it didn't work out well. And we also have the case of China, who never got money from them because they were more into Russians, and then in the end they work out economically well. So we have stories from both of them. Then we have Afghanistan, who didn't went to IMF, but they are really bad on economy. So we have good stories, bad stories. We can really say if it was a good idea or bad idea. It only happened, and it shaped the world in how this work. And finally, the last thing that they did, apart from setting these things, because this kind of push the agenda, this kind of push the role of how things were going to work. The last thing that they did was that they said these countries said, we are going to forget about the gold standard because this doesn't work. So this thing, they say it doesn't work. But what we are going to do, and it's quite funny, they say, instead of gold, we are going to use the dollar standard. So instead of doing this division of gold over your own currency, you're going to do dollars over your own currency. So if you want to become richer, you need to have more dollars. That's what the US said. And people were like, ah, this is quite, I don't know, like unfair, but they won the war and they had nuclear weapons, so we will say no to them. So in the end, it were like that, but for only about 30 years, because 1973, something unexpected happened. I already told you, Germany and Japan were doing so well that they were acquiring dollars. So similar to this, where people wanted to have gold, in here, countries wanted to have dollars, because more dollars, the better. So they wanted so many dollars that the US didn't have enough dollars to give them. So then the US went into a crisis, and then the world went into a crisis because say how this didn't work if you planned it. So in 1973, they dropped the gold standard and they said, you know what? Now it's totally free. It's totally supply and demand. So if more people want your currency because you have the World Cup, good. If people don't want your currency because there is corruption in your country, well, bad for you. So everything is supply and demand. So 1973, the gold standard ended and the dollar standard ended too. So we can say that at this time, everything in exchange rates, in terms of exchange rates, became supply and demand. And we are going to learn more about this in the next class. In the next class, we're going to go really deep into exchange rate systems and how do we define the price for currencies. So something really quick in here. I remember when I was a kid, my grandma told me that the value of money was supported by gold. That's what she told me in 1998 when I was a kid. So um, I believed on her, but apparently maybe she learned this when she was, I don't know, when she was a kid too. But this doesn't work anymore. If you have heard about it, like money is backed by gold, it doesn't work like that. It worked like that uh, like 100 years ago, but not anymore. So what happened later after this when they dropped this? When they dropped this, um, some countries decided to go completely free. Like they said, the market's going to tell us the price and we are not going to do anything. And other countries decided to do the opposite. Other countries said like, we are the government and we are going to manipulate supply and demand in order to set a rate. We're going to learn this about in the next class. But floating systems, it's also something for the next class, but floating systems where the government doesn't intervene and it's only supply and demand were very popular. But in 1997, there was a huge crisis in Southern Asia because of this. And why did this happen? Because these countries were very attractive in the 90s. Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia. They were very attractive because they produce a lot at cheap prices. So they receive a lot of money and they become richer. But then what happened at this time? Do you remember the, well, maybe you don't remember because you weren't born at this time, but in 2000 or by the end of the 90s, there was a huge boom for technology firms like Yahoo and American Online. Maybe you remember that. Microsoft, Apple also. So there was a huge bomb, and these companies became very popular. So all the money moved from manufacturing in Southern Asia to technology in the US. So they left with the money, and then these countries became extremely poor in 1 or 2 years, and that was terrible. So then they decided to change, and these countries say, like, you know what, we need to be more careful with this. We need to do the opposite, and we need to take care more about our currency. We need to intervene more. And Mexico, we did the opposite. When this happened, we became extremely fixed and extremely manipulate about the currency. The government wanted to control everything. And then 1994, huge crisis. Again, we have stories, good stories and bad stories from both sides. So in the case of Mexico, we did the opposite and we get the same result. And 1994, we decided to change and we decided to make the system that we have right now, which is more floating. We're going to talk about this in detail, which countries have what systems exist, which one is better, which one is bad. I'm saying that because it's not like a better or wrong. It's more about the context of the country and choosing the right option at that moment in that specific context. But I will tell you about this later. So I think this is the end. In the end, we finish like with this. We don't have gold standard. We don't have dollar standard. We experience a lot of things through history. I think this is maybe the most important thing that we need to remember because it happened 200 years ago, but we need to remember that war is not the answer, that conquering and um, stealing money from others or gold or whatever is not the answer. The answer is becoming attractive in the long term, being sustainable, having a model that will work for years and generations, that is not really about stealing and bullying other countries. I think that's the main um, message in here. So with this, I think I will end the presentation and I will end the class, but I will see you next class with the what's next, which is the exchange rate system.